He's held on before, so why is Evo Morales suddenly out in Bolivia? Is it, as he claims, a coup? The president had been taking on all comers since an October 20th election marred by irregularities and an unexplained interruption in the vote count that suddenly put him way ahead. Events coming to a head after the final report by the Organization of American States Observers, which called for a rerun of the poll. Morales, Sunday, first agreeing, then several hours later, announcing that shock resignation. We'll ask why. And police, as we have seen, starting to join the demonstrators. And the head of the army pledging not to fire on the people. Overnight, scenes of joy turned to looting and confusion over who's now running the country. How will Bolivia's democracy fare during the crucial hours and days to come? On Morales' watch, Bolivia's grown, but with commodity prices now slumping, it faces leaner times and growing inequality. Where does it all leave the left and the hopes born of the 2006 election of Bolivia's first indigenous head of state? Today in the France 24 debate, we're looking at Bolivia after Morales. Joining us, France24.com senior editor David Gormazano, who for Reporters, our investigative news magazine, went to Bolivia a few months back to report on the build-up to all of this. Thanks for being with us.
Good evening, Francois.
Also with us from Towson, Maryland, Nicole Fabricant, Associate Professor of Anthropology at Towson University. Welcome to the show.
Thank you.
And we want to welcome Mick Wallace, member of the European Parliament from the Independence for Change Party, who joins us from Ireland. Thank you for being with us. And from La Rochelle, Sébastien Uroste, professor at the University of La Rochelle on the Atlantic coast of France. Thank you for being with us.
Thank you.
The France 24 debate on Facebook and Twitter, hashtag F24debate. I ask you to stop attacking the brothers and sisters, stop burning and attacking. Those words, part of Evo Morales' resignation speech. Marios Sofos has more on a momentous Sunday.
Under mounting pressure from the Bolivian people, as well as the army, opposition parties and electoral monitors, Evo Morales announced his resignation as president of Bolivia on Sunday in a televised address. He said he was doing so for the good of the country, yet simultaneously scorned his rivals.
I resign my presidency. Why did I decide to resign? So that Carlos Mesa and Luis Fernando Camacho do not continue to persecute my brothers.
The announcement came just an hour after the commander of the Bolivian Armed Forces urged Morales to step down.
After analyzing the internal conflict situation, we asked the president of the state to renounce his presidential mandate to allow for peace.
It also came as the Organization of American States said that there had been clear manipulation in last month's election. Bolivian Vice President Alvaro Garcia Linera also resigned. Morales claimed to have won re-election last month, which then plunged the country into the biggest crisis of his nearly 14 years in power. The unrest left 3 people dead and over 100 injured in clashes between his supporters and opponents.
Evo Morales, who's been tweeting about it all in the past hours, here's what he had to say. The coup plotters who ransacked my house and that of my sister, set fire to homes, issued threats against ministers and their children, and insulted a mayor, now tell lies and try to blame us for the chaos and violence they've caused. Bolivia and the world lay witness to the coup, calling it a coup. Would you call it a coup, Sebastian Uroste?
Thank you for the invitation. Well, what you traditionally call a coup means that you have an overthrow of a government by the use of violence, specifically in the Latin American history by the military. There's this after what is called a pronunciamiento, means a public manifesto, and then follows a series of apprehension operations. Right now, there is not the military has not taken over power. That's quite the opposite. Right now, there is a void of power. There is a vacuum of power, and the military isn't patrolling the streets. The military hasn't started to apprehend anybody, and they haven't suspended the constitution. So, in the way you would define a coup in Bolivian history, this is not one.
This is not a coup. We've had this president who took on all comers, who, despite a referendum which was against lifting term limits, got the courts to do otherwise, and this time he resigned. Why?
So this time he resigned because progressively after the election he lost most of his support. So not only there were mobilizations in the streets, rallies, what are called cabildos, but after the police decided to rebel, there was a mutiny. A couple of hours later, the American Organization of States published its report saying there was a clear manipulation. Well, he started to lose his alliances, his allies, his supports among what used to be the block of governability he used to have. So not only from outside of the state, not only from outside of the mass, the movement towards socialism, but also what used to be his support among the civil society. So he had no way to enforce the law, his decisions, since both the police and the military were not obeying to him anymore. The military declared that he should step down. He couldn't use the unions as he used to do before. So this was what you would call an attrition process, where he progressively lost control over the territory and he could not govern anymore as he used to do.
Yeah, this process of attrition, but you get the sense, David Gormezano, that events have speeded up in the last 48 hours.
Yeah, it went very fast. It all started on Friday, with the police retreating from the streets and going back to their barracks. In particular, with the police unit who's in charge of the security of the presidential palace leaving the premises, leaving the presidential palace open. And then from Friday, I don't think Evo Morales has been able to access his presidential palace. He was in between the airport in El Alto and his strong place in the Chapare region, which is in the center of the country.
Do we know where he is right now?
No, we don't know precisely where he is. It is very likely that he is in the Chapare, because the Chapare is this region where he started his political career as a trade union leader of coca growing farmers. And he has been tweeting today. He's been tweeting quite a lot. But there is rumors about his precise location, but we don't know for a fact where he is at the moment.
Don't know for a fact where he is. And we spoke to one journalist who was present at the doors of the parliament, on Parliament Square. You still have those opposition supporters who've been there since the October 20th election. And so lawmakers not making their way to the parliament. So therefore, talk about a power vacuum. There's nobody to constitutionally to take Morales' place.
Absolutely. There is in the line of succession after the president has resigned. There's a long line of succession, and the 4 or 5 first names have all resigned. And another problem is that there's no one to call for a parliament session to discuss matters. One matter being having a new interim president with a mission to organize new elections.
Yeah, and by the way, there have been arrests. Among those picked up, the head of Bolivia's Supreme Electoral Tribunal, Maria Eugenia Choque, who stepped down after the release of those OAS findings on just a few days ago. So nobody in charge at the parliament, nobody in charge at the presidential palace, nobody in charge at the electoral commission. Nicole Fabricant, what are the possible scenarios?
So from word on the ground, it seems like it's utter chaos right now. there's many possible scenarios. My greatest fear is a resurgence of a kind of right-wing fascism. And I've done a lot of work in the Santa Cruz region for a long period of time. And I think this power vacuum leaves Bolivia very vulnerable, right? There were moments where Morales had made certain pacts with the right wing in the Santa Cruz region, and it had quelled a lot of their resistance to this regime. We have seen through Luis Camacho and the Pro Comité Santa Cruz and the images of Unión Juvenil Cruceñista, and these are like strong arms of the business community in Santa Cruz, that there is a very real possibility for them to usurp and seize, state power in this moment. And I think that's very concerning across, the board. There's other possibilities. I think that folks are more hopeful, right? That in this moment we will see, people are talking about the complete fracaso, right, of the MAS, and maybe social movements that have a long history of ebbing and flowing, right, have been to a certain extent demobilized, under the MAS regime. And who knows what's possible, right, out of crisis in Bolivia. It's really hard to predict what will happen.
Really hard to predict what will happen. Spain's foreign ministry stopping shy of calling it a coup, but saying this intervention, quote, takes us back to the moments in the past history of Latin America. Let's listen to the foreign minister, who's soon going to be the EU's foreign policy chief, Josep Borrell.
We are worried because we don't know who is going to take this process on. And because it was the intervention of the army calling on the president to step down that created this power vacuum.
Well, with us from Brussels is Mick Wallace, member of the European Parliament from the Independent for Change party. Do you agree with the words of Josep Borrell?
Well, he is really insinuating that, it is a military coup if an army forces the elected president to resign. That's called a coup, and that's exactly what it is, as far as I can see. Borrell's obviously being careful with his words and probably seeing how things are going to transpire. But listen, things haven't been looking good for a while. The OAS, or the Organization of American States, haven't covered themselves in glory either. They have given no evidence that there was anything wrong with the elections. They were very quick out of the blocks to be critical. But listen, we're well aware of the fact that this is an organization that gets 60% of its funding from the US, and the US would rather see a regime change, and that looks like what they're going to get.
But Mick Wallace, how do you explain discrepancies in the ballot box in certain regions, and also that 24 hours where mysteriously the vote count stopped and they never explained it?
Did you ask me that question?
No, that's from Mick. That's from Mick.
First of all, I was out there at the time. I was an observer for the GUI NGL group in the European Parliament. And the quick count, as it's called, they're obliged, well, they're actually not even obliged, but they said that they would make a statement on how the count was going after it went over 80%. And I think it reached 83.9%. When they announced the figures up to that point, and it showed them with Morales almost 8 percentage points ahead. And they stopped the quick count because the official count was starting, and they wanted to avoid confusion. But as it turned out, there was so much the right-wing opposition were crying foul before all the results were even in. And under pressure, the electoral authorities decided to restart the quick count while the official count was going on.
So, Sebastian,
given the fact that
I'm just gonna,
sorry, but given the fact that the 15% of votes that still hadn't come in were mostly from poor areas and from the mountains, where Morales was particularly strong, the fact that he would make up 2% out of the last 15 in areas where he was particularly strong is nothing unusual.
Sebastian Uroste, did the vote count bother you? The result?
I was there. I was there the day of the election, correct. And I was there precisely when the electoral court decided to stop the counting. They called for a recess, and there were no guidelines. There were no comments on that. The fact is that the report of the American organization what's important here to recall is that the government asked for the organization to make an audit of the elections, and they said it would be a mandatory report. At the beginning, the opposition didn't believe in the sincerity, in the trustiness of this report. Nevertheless, the report came as saying that there was a series of what you would call manipulations, not only involving here the quick count, but most of all, according to them, there had been a series of wrongdoing, especially abroad in Argentina. The fact you
all right, we're gonna I'm gonna interrupt you, Sebastian, just for a minute because we have to take a quick break. Stay with us. You're watching the France 24 debate. Welcome back, or welcome if you're just joining us. It's the France 24 debate, and we're looking at the confused situation in Bolivia. Many talking of a power vacuum. What with the president tendering his resignation and the parliament so far not convening, the president of the Electoral Commission, who on Sunday police said was under arrest. We're talking about it with David Gormezano, journalist at France 24. With us from Towson, Maryland, Nicole Fabricant, associate professor of anthropology at Towson University outside of Baltimore. Mick Wallace, member of the European Parliament, joins us from Brussels. He is with Ireland's Independence for Change party. And from La Rochelle here in France, Sebastian Uroste, who teaches at the University of La Rochelle. Sebastian, just before the break, you were telling us you were there for the vote count. How did it seem to you then?
So at that moment, I was only present at one of the recintos, one of the schools where the vote was being performed. So when the quick count was stopped, there was a huge sense of uncertainty because basically what the results were giving that there was going to be a second round. As a matter of fact, that's why Carlos Mesa, the second candidate most voted, presented himself as the opposition candidate for the second round. But lately, a couple of minutes after, the president presented himself as the winner in the first round. So both candidates presented different narratives on the very same day of the election, while the quick count had stopped. That's why the sense of confusion and tension started very, very soon.
How did it get to this?
Well, one of the reasons you can find if you go back in time, in 2016 referendum, when President-elected Evo Morales asked by a referendum to reform the constitution and be allowed to present himself for the four times. There was a referendum. The results, 51.3% of the Bolivian electorate said they didn't want him to, or anybody by that matter, to represent itself for the fourth time. He bypassed that decision. Those you could see clearly. I was there doing surveys the day of the election. There was a clear erosion, decrease of the support with regard to President-elected Morales. So because after the election, this fraud, we would call it fraud scandal that started to be risen up by the opposition, quickly had basically storm a lot of minds while you have this escalate. And this escalation of events got a very critical moment last Friday when the national police, decided they would get into mutiny. A couple of hours later, the Organization of American States published its report with regards to what they call the severe manipulations of the elections. That's when President Morales decided to call for new elections and to renew the electoral tribunal. But at that moment, he started to lose support from his previous allies, the Central Obrera Boliviana, the highest union organization, and many of his members of his cabinet, senators, started to resign. And later, the military asked for him to step down. That's why basically he had lost most of the support as a government per se. That's why he decided to leave. So there are immediate reasons, but you have long-term reasons.
Long-term reasons. And Nicole Fabricant, would you agree that it was a quote-unquote original sin on the part of Morales, who had long been heralded as, you know, Bolivia's first indigenous president who'd managed to help the lot of the worse off in his country, who then decides to, well, railroad through the end of term limits?
Yes, absolutely. I think a lot of the commentary from abroad and even in Bolivia of a left intellectual community is he should have left a while ago, you know, and in a dignified way could have left a kind of lasting legacy, right, of some of the economic improvements and quality of life and social programs. But many of us, both in Bolivia, I think a Bolivian intellectual community and from abroad have been rather critical, right, of sort of the promises and the discourse of Morales and the actual sort of extractivist agenda on the ground, right, and the ways in which that has created all sorts of conflicts amongst indigenous peoples, uprooted communities. You know, it's been a really conflictive regime, to say the least, right? And the hopes, I think, of this being sort of a bastion. I was there the year that he actually rose to power in 2006 and 2007, and that was an incredible moment in Bolivia, coming out of kind of the neoliberal era and the water wars in Cochabamba, the gas wars. I think a lot of movements, social movements across sectors had a lot of hope for what this regime would represent in undoing neoliberal economics in Bolivia, and had, I think, great hopes for a truly redistributive agenda. And, you know, I think that we have seen from afar and in Bolivia the sort of loss of the bases over the years, right? And a fractioning highland to lowland, and the Pacto de Unidad has surely fractured as well. So
David Gormazano, you reported for us from some of those areas, and when you see today, as you heard Sebastian say, the trade unions, the rank and file of the police desert Morales, are you surprised?
Somehow, yes, I'm quite surprised that it went so wrong, and I think Evo Morales has a great responsibility in what happened in the last few days. But we shouldn't forget that there are strategies by the right-wing opposition to come back to power. And right now, Bolivia is in chaos. We don't know where it is going, but there is clearly two strategies. Carlos Mesa has a strategy.
This is the former president who was running against Morales.
Exactly, and who is, as a minimum, he has 35% of the vote. He maybe has more than that, but he was the main contender in this election. And he wants Parliament to sit and to designate an interim president and to come back to constitutional normality, to have new elections and to keep on that path, on a legal path. On the other hand, during those last 3 weeks, there's a new character that has emerged.
Let's talk about that new character right now. That new character is civic leader Luis Fernando Camacho. Andrew Hillier has more.
Throughout Bolivia's anti-government protests, Luis Fernando Camacho has gone from relative obscurity to becoming a symbol of the opposition. Camacho grew up in Santa Cruz, Bolivia's biggest city and an opposition stronghold. At the age of 23, he joined the right-wing Santa Cruz Youth Union, a movement that human rights advocates have accused of behaving like a paramilitary group and of targeting indigenous people's property. He's now a civic leader for a group that claims to support democracy. With his deeply religious conservative background, he stands in marked contrast to Evo Morales, who has kept religion at arm's length and fought mainly for indigenous people's rights. Camacho rose to prominence immediately after the contested vote that took place on October 20th. He quickly called for a general strike in his hometown of Santa Cruz, a call that was heeded by many protesters.
We want President Evo Morales to go. We need him to go because that's what we've decided. He has made a mockery of us all, of rural and indigenous people.
On Sunday, he followed through on his threat to deliver a resignation letter in person to Morales in La Paz for the embattled president to sign. He also carried a Bible, a stunt designed to appeal to Bolivia's conservative Catholics, telling supporters that he wanted to restore God to the presidential palace.
So, David, in that report, what do you make of those images we saw of Camacho sitting next to an indigenous
leader? Yeah, called the Poncho Rojo, which was one of the basis, who was one of it's the core of the movement that led to the election of Evo Morales.
So what's that all about?
In the last few years, as our guest said, there's been a lot of conflicts. Part of the basis, part of the followers of Evo Morales have left him over different type of conflicts. And to see Fernando Camacho, who is very right-wing, sitting next to a Poncho Rojo leader from the highlands of Bolivia, doing a joint press conference, that is unheard in Bolivia, and says a lot of how different opposition groups have managed to convene to put to an end to the era of Evo Morales. So I would just like to add that Fernando Camacho has a clear strategy, and he's spoken about it yesterday night, saying, I want a government made of militaries, of leaders from civil society, and he wants to go out from the constitutional path. So you have Carlos Mesa on one hand, Fernando Camacho on the other hand. Both represent the opposition, but the two have very different strategies. And I think in the next few days, it is very important to see which strategy will prevail over the other.
Mick Wallace, what's going to be the key?
Well, listen, obviously there's going to be a lot of instability and turmoil for a while. That's what happens when there's intervention like this. Listen, I mean, just listening to the other speakers there, I mean, everyone was kind of the opinion that things were gradually kind of unraveling a bit. But you must remember there was strategies at play. There was a lot of pressure on Morales. Anyone that doesn't adhere to the neoliberal agenda is going to come under pressure, much like what's happening in Venezuela.
He didn't outstay his welcome? You don't think he outstayed his welcome after that 2016 referendum?
Yeah, I tell you what, I do. I actually do, right? And now, at the same time, okay, he used the Supreme Court, nullified the referendum, and that's what happens. The Supreme Court is top dog in America as well. And yes, does the government of the day have a big influence over the makeup of the Supreme Court? Absolutely, but that's part of the way we run our countries. It's the same in Ireland. It's the same across Europe. The Supreme Court usually reflects the government or the last few governments that were in power. But yeah, no, I actually think that it would have been better if Morales hadn't stood a fourth time, but yet at the same time, the manner in which he has been disposed of is seriously undemocratic. It's a different issue to the fact that he stood a fourth term. And I agree he shouldn't have stood a fourth term. But he was elected, and I don't accept that the OAS has given us no concrete evidence that there was fraudulent play. This is the same OAS that in Haiti in 2000 and again in 2011 literally cooked the books. So, I mean, they do feel a lot of pressure from the Americans. And on this occasion, Ruby was calling the elections fraud before the counting started. I mean,
Marco Rubio.
The Americans are serious. Marco Rubio, yeah. And look what I mean. The Americans have interfered in the elections of about 30 countries in Latin America over the last number of years. They have bombed over 30 countries. They've since the Second World War. I mean, they have tried to dispose of over 50 leaders since the Second World War. I mean, it's the Monroe Doctrine. They think that they can do what they like in what they call their backyard, and the Americans have certainly had a big play in what's going on in Bolivia.
Sebastian Uriarte, do you agree that the United States' hand is there in what's going on in Bolivia in this crisis?
Well, right now I have no material evidence to point that, nor do I have any material evidence to say there is a Venezuelan or Cuban influence or a Russian influence. The thing is that right now the internet is full of a lot of theories with a lot of explanations, but by my experience in Bolivia the day of the elections is that there was a sense that the results were moving towards a second round, and the second round has not happened. So the problem we're facing right now is that you have between 40 and 45% of the population who voted for Evo Morales saying that this is unfair, that this is a coup, and you have around 55% of the population that didn't vote for him in the first round, that most of them, or a lot of them, wanted a second round. Then the discourse escalated, then they wanted new elections, and then you have a sector, more radicalized one, that asked for him to resign. So the moods have been changing, have been escalating, and right now the evidence I have is that what happened in Bolivia was made by Bolivians. So I cannot say right now there is an implication from foreign powers. The thing that can be, of course, be pointed is that an international organization, a political organization such as the American States Organization, first was not welcome by the opposition because they thought that the same institution had given free way for Morales to be re-elected. Let's not forget the President Almagro, the secretary of the OEA, went to El Chapare, and he was present where Morales started his campaign. Basically, he was blessing him for presenting himself again as a candidate. But turns out right now the same organization, or at least the mission, the group, the task that was in Bolivia during the audit now has come to the conclusion that there were severe manipulations. So the same organization has different stands, different positions on the same, with regard to the same country.
Regard to the same country, I want to come back to what David Gormazano was saying, which was the two very different strategies on the part of the opposition. Nicole Fabricant, let me ask you first of all, who's the leader of the opposition right now?
That's a complicated question, right? I think on the ground in Bolivia, there's certainly, as has already been articulated by this group that you've gathered, there's a very strong right wing. This has existed for a very long time in Bolivia. When I was there 2006 and 2007, I was doing some research on the international connections between Bolivia's right and U.S. right, and I've written extensively about Procomete Santa Cruz, which is an assortment of business interests in the Santa Cruz region. And I think that's one part of the opposition, right? And Unión Juvenil Cruzeñista is really a strong arm of the civic committee in Santa Cruz. They are the thugs, as folks would call them. They go out with the bats and have historically beaten indigenous peoples in the region. When I was there in 2006 and 2007, they lashed out at any migrants. So they would cruise around, the outer rings of Santa Cruz in the migrant districts and beat up anyone who was de pollera. So you have this very fascist sort of alignment in Santa Cruz.
Is this what's unfolding, Nicole? Are we headed towards, because we saw that press conference where you have Camacho sitting next to that indigenous leader. Is there going to be this sort of new dichotomy or polarization, if you will, between indigenous people and Europeans?
That'll be interesting to see. I mean, my feeling is that the right is using this as an opportunity. They are going to utilize the Ponchos Rojos and they're going to utilize indigenous peoples to whatever extent they can, but their identity is very ethno-racially and regionally tied. So there's been a historic context, right, for a lot of the racism, explicit racism against indigenous peoples. So I don't envision beyond a short term a real alliance between indigenous peoples and the Camba, as they call themselves, right wing. However, in this moment, I think a lot of folks have articulated, even for those of us who have studied and been on the ground in Bolivia for 20 plus years, it's hard to really say what the future is going to hold around the right or even these new alliances that might be taking shape and form.
All right, let me ask, because we're out of time. Sebastian Uroste, just let me ask you: can the Constitution, can democracy in Bolivia hold up under this strain that we're witnessing?
Well, these sort of moments have been, it's not the first time, it's not unprecedented. For instance, in 78, because there was a coup and the Congress decided one member of the Senate would become the president of the Senate and therefore assume the presidency. So it is not unprecedented. What is changing right now is that Evo Morales used to be the leader of the opposition between the 2000 and 2005. Then he became a head of state. He has right now pronounced a very strong, vehement discourse calling for the resistance. He might become again the leader of the opposition by going back to El Chapare and starting a series of blockades. I just wanted to add something with regards to Camacho. The fact that the right makes alliances with the campesinos, with indigenous leaders, is not new either. What happened with General Barrientos in the 60s, it is not really uncommon that indigenous leaders get alliances with members of the right.
All right, so Bolivia's been there before on several counts, and the future is unwritten. I want to thank you, Sebastian Uroste, for joining us from La Rochelle. Mick Wallace, member of the European Parliament, for being with us from Brussels. Nicole Fabricant from Towson, Maryland. David Gormazano, stay with us. Media Watch is next. Thank you. Let me say hello to Emma James.
Hi there. Yes, just taking a look at how this is all playing out in the media and on social media too.
And we heard one of the panelists saying there's been a lot of, I don't know if I'd call it disinformation, but yeah, I guess you can.
Yes, you can. There's an awful lot of disinformation. Looking on social media, you're seeing things like this. Hi, I'm Bolivian. I'm also a political science student, and this is a flat-out lie. Funny how you hate propaganda, but use it yourself. A tweet there from somebody called Nessaco. But as this person points out, growing numbers of these likely fake pro-coup accounts. This one can't even get its lies straight. Bolivian in the tweet and American in the bio. You see there, she says she's a political science student and an American. This one too made me laugh. I'm really enjoying the insightful analysis about the situation in Bolivia from Hector and a string of numbers whose account was created 5 minutes ago. It does really seem to be quite a coordinated effort to get certain points of view pushed to the fore. It's also difficult to get to the root of exactly what's happening in Bolivia from more official sources. Evo Morales himself tweeting that there's an illegal arrest warrant issued against him, something that the police have denied. Other people have agreed with it. It's impossible to know, sitting here in Paris, exactly which is true of those. What we have seen, though, celebrations and unrest ever since he stood down. And this purports to be a video of his home. Dozens of people inside. Clearly, quite a bit has been destroyed and lots of graffiti in there too. And there are quite a few accounts of homes being attacked, homes of journalists set on fire and the like. So there is a considerable unrest in Bolivia right now. On Twitter as a whole, there do seem to be two camps. It's very clearly divided. Supporters who call it a coup and those using the hashtags like Evo, you're not welcome, Morales defeated. So where exactly did it all go wrong? Because, of course, it's worth remembering that this is a man who oversaw huge economic growth, huge falls in poverty levels as well, going down from 60 to 36% of people living in poverty. So that's millions of people so much better off. But here we are with this situation now. Now, Yasha Munk has written a very interesting piece in The Atlantic where he basically accuses Morales of attacking Bolivia's democracy for many years. He said he wanted to overstay the constitutional limits. He'd been in power for 14 years already. Having lost the referendum very narrowly, he then convinced the Constitutional Court to allow him to run again. And what he says in this article is that basically, he may have ruled as a man of the people, but he chose to ignore what the people said with that referendum. And he lost their support because, he says, people resent arbitrary rule. This writer also very critical, too, of left-wing Western politicians who are seduced by the idea of the pink tide, that rush of socialist and left-wing leaders who swept to power in Latin America some sort of 20 years ago. And it's interesting to see how many of the Western left-wing leaders are jumping to support Evo Morales. Here in France, the leader of La France Insoumise, Jean-Luc Mélenchon, calling this a military putsch, saying that friends of the US and the EU have restored their democracy. Beatings of journalists and elected officials, he says, are now taking place, and he claims that that's what the EU and the US want, which seems a little bizarre. Jeremy Corbyn in the United Kingdom, who is very much the left of the Labour Party, the opposition party, he says that he condemns this coup, especially after such a powerful movement has brought so much social progress forced from office by the military is appalling. But it does remind me of one tweet I saw earlier which said, when the left protests, it's a revolution. When the protest is against the left, it's a coup. Interesting thought.
Emma James, many thanks. I want to thank our panel once again. Thank you for joining us here in the France 24 debate.